the flashing blue lights of the precinct cruisers cut through, the heavy fog surrounding my estate. Behind me, 80 million in legal deeds lay scattered like fallen leaves across the mahogany study. I didn't move as the handcuffs clicked, because I knew this was the only way to end my mother's performance. The clock on the wall was ticking toward midnight, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of the silence. The charcoal leather folder sat in front of me, heavy as a heartbeat. Inside were the deeds, my grandmother's 25th birthday gift to me, an $80 million luxury resort with my name etched onto every legal document. But before I could even take a breath of relief, the heavy oak front door swung open. My mother walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, with her new husband trailing right behind her like a shadow. "We should manage this together as a family," she said, her smile as polished and cold as a trophy. She acted as if the world still revolved around her commands, when I looked her in the eye and said, "Absolutely not. I am the sole owner now," her expression fractured. "Then pack your bags and leave this house tonight," she snapped. I didn't argue. I didn't even move, because I knew something they didn't. That night wasn't about their desperate demands. It was about my grandmother's next move, one that would end their little theatrical performance for good. When people look at me now, they see the high-rise resort, the vast marble floors, the shimmering glass lobby, and the name Julian Thorne etched in gold above the grand entrance. But what they don't see is the noise that used to live inside this family. My grandmother, Eleanor Thorne, built everything from a single, dusty roadside motel in the mountains. She was 25 then, exactly my age now, and everyone called her a fool. But she turned those doubts into brick, mortar, and massive revenue. By the time I was born, the Thorne collection had become a name people whispered with both envy and respect. My mother Lydia inherited none of Eleanor's patience. She only inherited her crushing pride. To her, success wasn't about the labor of building. It was about the thrill of being seen. She loved camera flashes more than architectural blueprints. She loved control more than she ever loved her own family. My father, Arthur, was the complete opposite. He was a calm, steady man who believed in doing things the right way, even when the right way took longer. He ran the daily operations for years, quietly keeping the entire empire standing while Lydia chased social status and appearances. When I was 18, I watched that fragile balance finally collapse. I still remember the night Dad left. I can see his tired eyes and that lone suitcase by the door. He told me he couldn't stay in a house where love had become nothing more than a scripted performance. The silence that followed him out the door was the kind that fills every corner of a room and never truly leaves. After he left, Lydia remarried almost instantly. Victor Sterling, a smooth-talking investment consultant who spoke in empty buzzwords like synergy and global expansion. He was everything Lydia thought success looked like, shiny, loud, and completely hollow. Not long after the wedding, she sent me to live with my grandmother, claiming it was for my own stability. I knew better. I was just one less witness to the life she was trying to build. Life with Eleanor was quiet, but it was never dull. Her home always smelled of aged cedar and strong coffee. Her mornings began with the rhythmic clack of typewriter keys. She treated me not as a child to be hidden, but as an apprentice to be forged. I studied structural engineering while she showed me what legacy truly meant: discipline, calculated risk, and the raw courage to start over when the world calls you finished. Sometimes at night, I'd catch her looking over old property maps, the original sketches she had drawn by hand when she had nothing. She'd trace the faded outlines with a soft, knowing smile and say, "Every building tells a story, Julian. The walls remember who built them and why. Never forget that foundations aren't just made of stone. They are made of character." I didn't fully understand then that she was also talking about the kind of foundations we build within ourselves. Years passed. My mother's phone calls grew shorter, and her words grew sharper with every passing month. "You should visit," she'd say, her voice tight. "Victor wants to talk about the Asian market." Expansion. I'd always have a final exam or a major project due, and the conversation would always end with her disappointed sigh. We were strangers, connected only by blood and legal paperwork. Until that morning, my 25th birthday, Eleanor asked me to sit at her desk. The leather folder was waiting there, heavy and unfamiliar. She looked at me and said, "This is your inheritance, Julian. But it's also your test." I didn't know what she meant by test. Not yet. But I would find out soon enough. Because sometimes the exact moment you receive everything you've ever wanted is the same moment you find out who is coming to take it all away from you. I have maintained the exact emotional depth and sophisticated English tone of your original script, ensuring the word count remains high and the suspense builds perfectly. Toward the final showdown, dinner that night felt like a grand celebration. Roasted duck, the flickering glow of candlelight dancing across the long oak table, and grandmother smiling in that rare, peaceful way she only reserved for victories. For once the house was silent, filled only with the rhythmic sound of silver scraping against fine china. I remember thinking, for just a fleeting second, that maybe the foundations were finally steady. Then the doorbell rang. It was one of those small, sharp sounds that changed the trajectory of a life. I stood up, the linen napkin still gripped in my hand. When I opened the door, the biting chill from the porch hit me first, followed immediately by the suffocating scent of her expensive perfume. My mother, Lydia, stood there in a cream-colored cashmere coat, her hair curled into perfect, rigid waves. Her smile was stretched thin, glossy, and entirely artificial. Beside her was Victor, her husband, the consultant. He wore that signature smug confidence that always smelled like cheap cologne and expensive deceit. "Julian!" Mom's voice dripped with a forced, sugary cheer. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. We were just in the area and thought we'd stop by to celebrate our favorite CEO. Behind me I heard the soft, deliberate scrape of grandmother's chair against the hardwood floor. They didn't wait to be invited in. They stepped past me as if they still owned the air in the room. Victor carried a silver gift bag, the kind of expensive gesture people make when they already know exactly what they want to take in return. Mom's eyes didn't settle on me. They darted around the room until they landed on the leather folder sitting prominently on the dinner table, my inheritance. "We heard about your big gift," she said, her tone sugar-wrapped but laced with a lethal poison. $80 million. How wonderful for you." I tried to stay polite, keeping my voice as steady as the architecture I had studied. "It's not about the number, Mother. Grandmother wanted me to continue the legacy she spent 50 years building." Lydia laughed lightly, waving a manicured hand as if my words were a charming joke. Of course. But Julian, darling, running an empire of this magnitude isn't for children. You'll need real-world experience, professional guidance. That's why Victor and I thought we could manage it together, as a family." The word family landed like a physical slap in the face. Victor leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the back of one of the dining chairs. "It's far too much for one person to shoulder, Julian. Let us help you navigate the sharks. You've already drafted a formal management proposal." Grandmother's voice sliced through the air like a cold blade. "A proposal for something that does not belong to you." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Victor's practiced smile faltered. Mom shot grandmother a warning look, the same cold, sharp defiance she used to weaponize against my father years ago. "Mother, please, let's be practical for once." "Practical?" Grandmother repeated the word as if she were tasting something bitter. "Like when you mortgaged the mountain property without my authorization? Or when you disappeared for 6 months to expand and came back with 10 million in unexplained debt?" The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking older, more desperate. "That was years ago. I was learning." "Yes," grandmother said softly, her eyes like flint. "And I remember every single year it cost me to fix your mistakes." I stood there in the center of the room, the tension pressing against my ribs like a physical weight. The room smelled of rosemary, rain, and unspoken rage. Mom turned back to me, her voice becoming brittle, almost pleading. "Julian, don't let her turn you against me. We're blood. We should rebuild this family together." I wanted to believe her. Part of me still craved the mother. I thought I had, but the predatory way she looked at that folder told me the truth. This wasn't about rebuilding a family. It was about reclaiming the power she had squandered and the lifestyle she could no longer afford. Grandmother rose from her chair with a dignity that made the room feel small. She rested a steady, warm hand on my shoulder. "Dinner is over," she said calmly. "Some things are simply not up for discussion." Victor cleared his throat, forcing a jagged smile back onto his face. "Of course. We'll talk again soon, Julian. When you've had time to think clearly." But as the door closed behind them, I caught the whisper my mother left hanging in the doorway. A quiet, venomous hiss meant only for my ears. "This isn't over." And she was right. It was only the beginning. The next morning, the house didn't feel like home anymore. The light through the tall windows looked different, colder. Thinner, as if the very walls knew a storm was coming, grandmother spent the majority of the day in her study with the doors firmly closed. I could hear the faint, steady clack, clack, clack of a typewriter, a rhythm more certain than my own frantic heartbeat. Downstairs, I found the breakfast table already occupied by the intruders. My mother sat there with a cup of coffee she hadn't been offered, flipping through one of grandmother's old leather ledgers as if it already belonged to her. Victor was pacing by the window, speaking in low, urgent tones into his phone, whispering phrases like potential restructuring, asset liquidation, and joint control. They didn't see me at first, and for a long minute, I watched them, two predators wearing the skin of a family as camouflage. Mom finally looked up, her smile crisp and professional. "Morning, sweetheart. Victor and I were just brainstorming. a few ways to keep the business stable during the transition. To protect your interests. Stable? I asked, keeping my voice as flat as possible. It's been stable for 50 years without your help. She ignored the jab, her eyes narrowing slightly. You're young, Julian. You have your master's degree to finish, your friends, your life. You don't need to stress yourself over payrolls, tax audits, or legal filings. That's what family is for, to handle the burden so you can enjoy the reward. Victor nodded, his tone oily and condescending. Let us take care of the boring parts, son. You just focus on graduating. I felt my pulse climb, but I said nothing. Instead, I walked over to the counter, poured myself a glass of juice, and let the silence stretch until it started to itch at their nerves. Then I turned to them. Does grandmother know you're here? Mom blinked, her lips tightening into a thin line. She's resting. She's old, Julian. She doesn't have the stamina for these details anymore. Right, I said quietly. Then maybe you should let her rest in peace. Their eyes followed me as I left the room, every step I took echoing through the house like a dare. That afternoon I went to grandmother's office. She didn't look surprised when I told her what I'd seen. She only sighed, looking out at the mountains she had conquered. I was hoping they'd at least pretend to wait a week, she whispered. Do you want me to call the firm's lawyers? I asked. She shook her head slowly. I already did. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a second folder, an identical silver one to mine. There are things you don't know about your mother and Victor. Financial documents, offshore deals that were meant to stay hidden in the shadows. My stomach tightened. Why didn't you tell me before? Because, grandmother said, her sharp eyes meeting mine with a terrifying clarity. Sometimes the only way to teach someone how to defend what is theirs is to let them feel exactly how easily it can be taken away. We have work to do, Julian. We spent the rest of the day in quiet surgical preparation. Grandmother called her personal attorney on a private line. I combed through years of digital files, labeling transactions that didn't add up. Payments to shell companies. Massive transfers, ghost accounts. The evidence was all there, buried under layers of Victor's consulting jargon. By the time the sun set behind the peaks, the house smelled of burnt coffee and old paper. Grandmother looked exhausted but entirely resolute. Tomorrow, she said, we'll invite them back for a final dinner. Let them think they've won. Let them think you are ready to sign. I nodded, finally understanding the game. If they wanted a stage to perform their lies, we would give them one. But this time the script belonged to us. The invitation was my grandmother's idea, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. A polite, formal message sent that morning. Dinner tonight. Let's discuss the transition of ownership. Properly, I watched. Her type every word with surgical precision on that old typewriter. It was bait, beautifully dressed as a white flag of peace. By 6 o'clock the table was set again. The same oak surface was polished to a mirror shine, with tall candles waiting to burn through the thick layers of lies. The house smelled of roasted garlic, red wine, and a quiet, vibrating tension that made the air feel heavy. Grandmother had changed into a dark navy silk dress, the one she only wore for high-stakes negotiations. Her expression gave absolutely nothing away. Stay calm. Julian, she whispered as she placed a thick silver folder beside my plate. Let them talk first. Let them dig their own graves with their own words. At 7 sharp, headlights swept across the gravel driveway. The front door opened without a knock. A final, arrogant display of entitlement. My mother entered first, her heels clicking like a metronome of greed. She wore a bold, blood-red dress. It was the color of someone who believed they were already in control. Victor followed close behind, his tie loosened and a wide, predatory grin on his face. Mother, Mom said sweetly, leaning in to kiss the air near grandmother's cheek. Julian, I'm so glad we're finally doing this properly. Family decisions deserve total transparency. I almost laughed at the irony. Dinner began in a strained, polite silence. Plates were passed and wine was poured, but I could feel their burning impatience. I watched Mom's fingers drum a restless rhythm on the table. I saw Victor's eyes constantly flicking toward the silver folder resting by my hand. Finally, Mom couldn't resist any longer. She set her fork down with a sharp clink. So let's be honest, she said, her voice dropping the act. Managing a resort? Group of this scale, $80 million in assets, is incredibly complex. It's fundamentally unreasonable to expect a 25-year-old to handle the legalities and the pressure alone. Grandmother sipped her wine, looking at them over the rim of her glass, saying nothing. Victor leaned forward, his voice oozing false confidence. We've already outlined the new structure, Julian. I'll handle the financial optimization and asset management. Lydia will oversee the public relations and brand image. And you? Well, you can shadow us for a few years. Learn the ropes from the professionals. Their words weren't proposals. They were instructions. They were telling me how they were going to spend my inheritance. I set my fork down and looked at them. So what you're saying is, I signed the ownership over to you both, and you manage everything while I watch from the sidelines? Victor's grin tightened. Precisely. For the good of the Thorne name. Grandmother finally looked up, her eyes unreadable and cold. And how exactly would that benefit Julian? Mom's smile grew even wider, though it never reached her eyes. It benefits everyone, Mother. We're family, after all. That word again, family. It felt filthy coming from her. I took a slow, deliberate breath. You're right, I said quietly. We are family. She leaned back, looking satisfied, thinking she had won. Good, then let's get the papers signed and... Which is why, I cut in, my voice growing cold. It's time we stop pretending this is about love or legacy. You wanted transparency? Fine, let's start with the truth. I pushed the silver folder toward the center of the table. Victor reached for it greedily, but Grandmother's hand moved faster, pinning it down. She opened the first page. The sound of the paper sliding was crisp and final. These, Grandmother said, her voice like steel, are bank statements from the secret offshore accounts. Withdrawals made under Lydia Thorne's private signature. Funds from the Thorne group that were diverted and never returned. The color drained from my mother's face instantly. Mother, that's absurd. Those were business expenses. Grandmother ignored her and flipped to the next page. And these are internal emails from Mr. Sterling's consulting firm. Proposals for overseas expansion projects that do not exist. Shell companies designed to siphon millions into your personal debts. Signed by both of you. Victor's jaw clenched so hard I thought it might break. You had no right to dig into my private firm's records. I had every right, Grandmother interrupted, her voice booming with a power I hadn't heard in years. You tried to mortgage the core. Resorts, the very heart of my life's work, to pay off your gambling, debts and failed investments. You thought I was too old to notice? You thought I was blind? The air in the room grew thick. The only sound was the fire crackling in the hearth. Mom's eyes darted to me, desperate and wild. Julian, this isn't true. She's twisting the numbers. You can't possibly believe her over your own mother. I didn't need to answer. Grandmother slid one last document across the table. The ownership amendment, she said, effective immediately. All control and voting power transfers solely to Julian Thorne. As of 5 minutes ago, you are both hereby removed from every board, every trust, and every property associated with this name. Mom stared at the page as if it were a death warrant. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice cracking. I already have, Grandmother replied. Then came the explosion. Mom shot up from her chair, her voice screeching with rage. This is my legacy, my life. You can't just hand it to him. He's a boy. He knows nothing. Grandmother remained seated, the picture of calm. You handed it away yourself the moment you chose greed over loyalty? Victor grabbed Mom's arm, muttering, let's just go. Lydia, we'll fight this in court. But she wasn't done. She pointed a trembling finger at me. You think you've won? You're a child playing at being a man. You'll drown in the paperwork before the month is out. You'll be begging me to come back and save you. I met her glare with a steady, unshakable gaze. Maybe, but at least it'll be my mess to clean, not yours to profit from. Her lip trembled. Rage was losing the battle to humiliation. Then pack your bags and leave this house. She spat, using the same word she had used days ago. But this time her voice sounded small, and that's when Grandmother laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was a soft, knowing chuckle that sliced through the room cleaner than any scream. You're right about one thing, Lydia, Grandmother said. Someone is leaving this house tonight, but it isn't Julian. For a second everything froze. Even the fire seemed to stop moving. Then Grandmother reached into her purse and placed a final, heavy envelope on the table. A court-authorized eviction and a formal summons. You've both been served. Fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. The investigators are waiting outside in the driveway. Victor's face went a sickly shade of grey. You called the police? I called justice, Grandmother said simply. 2 officers entered the room quietly. Their presence was polite but final. Victor didn't even try to fight. He just stared at the floor as they led him out in silence. Mom followed, her breath ragged, her eyes wild, caught somewhere between disbelief and total despair. When the door finally closed, silence filled the house again. But this time the silence was different. It was lighter. It was the kind of silence that heals instead of haunts. I sank into my chair, my hands finally beginning to tremble from the adrenaline. Grandmother reached over and placed her hand firmly over mine. I'm sorry you had to see that, Julian. No, I whispered. I needed to see it. I needed to see who they really were. She nodded once, her eyes glassy but strong. You handled yourself better than I ever did. You didn't raise your voice. You just stood your ground. I looked at the empty plates and the remnants of the storm we had just survived. Do you think she'll ever forgive us? I asked quietly. Grandmother sighed, looking into the fire. Forgiveness is for people who are capable of admitting what they've done. Your mother still thinks she's the victim of a robbery. She hasn't learned that you can't steal what you never earned. The fire popped softly, throwing golden light across the table. I realized then that this house, the same one where my father had walked out, years ago, where every fight had echoed louder than love, finally felt still. It finally felt safe. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the red and blue lights of the police cars painted the gravel driveway. Victor sat in the back of a cruiser. Mom stood frozen near the porch, her mascara streaking down her face in the cold night air. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't even feel relief. I just felt a deep, quiet ache for the family we could have been. If only they had loved us as much as they loved the money. Grandmother joined me at the window, her reflection appearing beside mine in the glass. "You did good, Julian," she said. "You didn't just inherit a business tonight. You inherited your own life." Her words settled in my chest like something permanent. As the last police car disappeared down the hill, the night finally exhaled. We didn't toast. We didn't celebrate. We just sat in the quiet glow of the fire, two survivors of the same bloodline, from different decades, finally breaking the pattern of greed. The morning after felt unreal. The house that had once hummed with tension was now filled with a peaceful quiet. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, landing on that silver folder. Grandmother was already up, sipping coffee in the kitchen, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But her shoulders looked lighter, and the lines on her face seemed softer, as if decades of weight had finally been lifted off her spirit. The news of the scandal spread fast. Victor disappeared into the legal system, his reputation in ruins. My mother stayed just long, enough to watch her name unravel, in every social circle she had once worshipped. The fraud case stripped her of everything, the money, the position, the pride. My father, Arthur, came by a few weeks later. He didn't make any speeches. He didn't ask 1,000 questions. He simply placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm proud of you, son. You did what I wasn't strong enough to do." I finished my engineering degree at the top of my class. We celebrated quietly at the resort's rooftop lounge. No press, no cameras, just the people who actually built the foundations. Grandmother raised her glass and said, "To new foundations." And as the city lights glowed below us, I realized that was exactly what this was. It was a rebuild, not of property or reputation, but of peace. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the leftover of someone else's legacy. I felt like the beginning of my own. I used to believe legacy was about bloodlines and famous last names, but I've learned it's actually about boundaries. It's about the courage to end what is toxic, even when it wears your DNA. My true inheritance wasn't an $80 million resort. My inheritance was freedom. If you've ever had to choose your own peace over your family's pride, share your story in the comments. You aren't alone.